Chapter 23 on metabolism and nutrition is one of those application chapters. So we're going to use the physiology from the alimentary canal and the digestive system to apply to actual real-life situations. So in this chapter we're going to review metabolism. It should be a 103 concept. We're going to look at metabolic states within the body, how they're governed, and then how the body can regulate feeding so that the essential nutrients are supplied to the living cells, look at metabolic rates and figure out how they're determined, and then how all of metabolism will rate to a homeostatic thermoregulation for the body. The final section gets in and analyzes the nutrients that are needed, and then for cardiovascular health we'll look at the importance of lipoproteins. So as an introduction, we know that energy within the human diet is measured in terms of heat. So that is the calorie, that's the big C, is the measure of heat. So the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius is the definition of a calorie. But the actual measurement is a much smaller measurement of heat, and the unit of a calorie to measure the human diet are kilocalories. So this is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So it was a gram with the big C, a kilogram with the little c. As far as metabolism, we know it's the sum of all of the chemistry that's going on in a living cell, all of the body's reactions. And we know that a lot of these are enzyme reactions, so the enzyme is acting as a catalyst, and we know that those are called metabolic pathways. You started with the initial reactant, you go through several intermediates, and then you wind up with the final product. So there's 4 basic processes that are involved with metabolism. We have to harness the energy. We know the energy is stored as ATP, so the chemical bonds from our diet, which would actually be the nutrients, have this storage or potential energy within them that we have to harness and to let go. So the second basic process is converting one type of molecule into another. So we know that large macromolecules are ingested, these polymers, but we have to break it down into monomers so that we can absorb it in the wall of the small intestine. There's also synthesizing that's going on. We know that once we take in those molecules like proteins, the polysaccharide, carbohydrates, your nucleic acids, and lipids, those were the 4 macromolecules that the body will reassimilate. So once it's broken down into their component pieces from the food, the body will then remake it into usable organic compounds within the living cells. And then finally, breaking down macromolecules. That's what I mentioned earlier. There's the conversion from one cell to the other type of reaction that goes on, and the monomer-polymer relationship that goes on. 2 types of metabolism. Remember, catabolism is involved with tearing down, and anabolism is involved with building up. So remember the definition for catabolism. You have reactions that are involved. One substance is broken down into its smaller or its subunits. So we know that when this begins to happen, the molecules itself, the whole chemical bonds within those molecules, release energy, and that energy can be used to drive other processes. That energy is needed for these metabolic pathways. So there's 3 different nutrient monomers that are able to generate ATP. The major preferred body source of energy is going to be from glucose. So we know glucose, the body will prefer that because it can be used very quickly. We know that it's stored in carbohydrates, or polysaccharides, starch, glycogen. It's carried out in every cell of the body. Metabolism for glucose, whether it be aerobic respiration or anaerobic fermentation. We know that brain and liver cells require and prefer glucose as their fuel source. So especially the brain, 3 to 4 to 5 minutes without oxygen and glucose for cellular respiration, those cells begin to die off, those neurons. The second group are the fatty acids. So we take this in mainly concerning triglycerides. Remember, triglycerides from biology class was a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids, hence the name triglyceride, that were attached to it. So the body can break down the triglycerides into free fatty acids and then glycerol. These are separate catabolic pathways, or they can be used by a cell for other purposes. We know that we need cholesterol from our fatty acids to strengthen the cell membrane. The third group are the amino acids. We know that these can be liberated from the breakdown of proteins. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Remember, they create the primary structure of the protein like a beaded necklace held together by the peptide bonds. So those free amino acids can go into several catabolic pathways, or they can be used as particular proteins within the cell or for other purposes. And we know that the major components of the plasma membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, are the proteins that are embedded in it. Most of the functions of the membrane occur because of the proteins that are there. So very much necessary for life as we know it at the cellular level. So with lipids, we said it breaks down into fatty acids and glycerol, goes through several processes, either can be delivered directly to the electron transport chain or can be involved in the prep reaction, or the glycerol can go into the glycolysis step. Remember, with carbohydrates, the building blocks of those are individual glucose or fructose or galactose units. You have the G3P, remember that's the first split from that, and then the pyruvates, the sweet things from splitting the sugar, use the transition reaction to get into the citric acid cycle and the matrix of the mitochondria. Where proteins, we said, are broken down by amino acids or into amino acids, and they can be involved with the pyruvate of glycolysis. They can go into the prep or transition reaction, or they can go directly to the citric acid cycle. With anabolism, we know that these reactions take smaller molecules, combine them together, and they create the larger polymer or macromolecule. So the cells will be able to use these smaller molecules to build or to comprise macromolecules like the 4 organic compounds that we discussed in biology: proteins, nucleic acids, lipids, and carbohydrates. So notice, again, with nutrient anabolism, you have glucose that, of course, can make glycogen. Remember, by glycogenesis, the new forms of glycogen. We can store that in our liver and our skeletal muscle cells. We know fatty acids through the process of lipogenesis, and some glycerol can be converted into lipids that are used throughout the body, especially, we said, cholesterol. Glycerol can also be used for gluconeogenesis. When glucose and the other saccharides are not available, glycerol and the amino acids with gluconeogenesis can be converted to new forms of glucose. They also, of course, will be used for protein synthesis and make the proteins that are very diverse functions within the body. So with this section, we define kilocalorie, which is the measurement of our dietary food, referring to how much energy is stored in those chemical bonds. Metabolism, the overall term, means all of the chemistry that's going on, so both catabolic and anabolic activity. Catabolism, to tear down; anabolism, to build up. And then we identified the nutrients that the body can use for a fuel source. The diagrams do a very good job with showing gluconeogenesis, glycogenesis, and the lipogenesis, as far as the lysis forms of those.